Okay, perfect, perfect. All right, with that, I just want to welcome everyone. So happy to have you here. Thanks again. And Brent, I will turn it over to you.
All right, terrific. Well, hey, thank you everybody for being on. I think we're a couple minutes late, but that's okay. Thank you for sticking in with us. My name is Brent Holden, as I was introduced. I'm the global field CTO here at HashiCorp. I think the best way to articulate that is I'm like the customer-facing side of Armon and Mitchell. So we have two co-CTOs and two co-founders in them. My job is really to meet with our executive customers to share our vision, and really to understand what their problems are, how they're addressing them, and then how we fit in. Um, so I think with that, maybe I could spend a few minutes talking through, give everyone the basics of like what does that vision look like? What are the problems that we try and solve, and maybe some basics of like how does HashiCorp perceive things like security, things like that. I think that we've only got 20 or 25 minutes or so. I definitely want to give Joyce enough time. She's certainly the speaker I'm looking forward to the most between the two of us. Uh, so I guess let me share my iPad, the cable. Hopefully everyone can see that. Allison, maybe you can just give me like a thumbs up or just let me know.
We're good.
We're good? Okay. I'm gonna turn off my video. I can like see myself. It's really distracting. But I'm here. I'm not AI. Okay, so I think like let's talk for a few minutes about what is HashiCorp's like just ethos and our vision, like where do we see the market going, and then how do we design against that? I think that's like a pretty good place to start. So I think with each of our customers, the ones I talk to, here are the challenges they're mostly facing. Challenges they face are that they have what they refer to as a primary data center, and there's nothing really spectacular about that. It's a four-wall place you go to, and customers are not necessarily looking to get rid of their primary data center anytime soon. Uh, there's certainly a motion to kind of downsize. I think most customers I talk to, they're going from, let's say, like 20 data centers down to four, maybe two. That's pretty common. But I'd say outside of that, the private data center is not necessarily going away anytime soon. Generally, like that's where your ERP systems will live. Oracle Business, PeopleSoft, traditional SAP, like they're kind of built for that space. Where we see customers sort of moving to is augmenting their infrastructure with a provider. I think AWS in the United States, being that we're talking mainly about US customers here. AWS is sort of the predominant provider that we see. In Europe, I see mostly Azure. In Asia Pacific, I see mostly Google, maybe surprisingly. But I think where most of our customers start, they always start with one. They just pick one. They say, okay, let's figure it out here, and then we'll see, where it goes from there. And so here's what we believe. Now, we believe that you're going to be a multi-cloud customer. Now, in the commercial space, it's mostly through M&A. I think for most of our public sector customers, they're looking at it through the lens of what's the best tool for the job. And so the best tool for maybe Linux and Java workloads is AWS, maybe .NET and Windows workloads go on Azure, maybe data science workloads go on, Google, for example, or maybe have Oracle or IBM in the mix as well, right? And so they all bring their own individual value in the sense of it's a unique workload. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, so there's some, super, like this is a super basic insight. I think everyone's experiencing this. Everyone I talked to in IT recently is sort of living this personally. But I think there's a couple of different layers here that are changing that, we should talk about. Right. So one layer that's changing is, the previous way we defined infrastructure was primarily static, meaning like you have VMware on-prem, you create a virtual machine, you give it an IP address, that thing is going to live for, however long, 10, 15 years, and its IP is how we track it through the data center, and we assign security to it that way. Now, in this new world with public cloud, things are going to change, not just metaphorically, but also, quite literally. We have to deal with sort of the dynamicism of the environments. These public clouds, they're going to expose a failure domain to you that you're not necessarily used to, in that, if you had hardware that failed under VMware, well, VMware would reassign machines to a different host for you, and that it was kind of transparent to you. Whereas in public cloud, if you have an availability zone that goes offline, you have a network that fails, you've got an instance that gets spontaneously rebooted, all those things are expected to happen. Likewise, you're going to have some, call it just technologies that they're really built for, that kind of dynamic provisioning sort of environment. Technologies like Kubernetes, you have pods spinning up and down, different egress points get created. It's just, that's the way we're going to have to look at IT in the future, is that we have this highly dynamic infrastructure. And because of that, we can't necessarily use the IP as our standard of security. We have to use an identity. So I think that's one sort of very fundamental change that's happening. I think the second fundamental change that's happening is from a security perspective. It's actually the opposite way. This is a super high trust environment where our previous on-prem, estates, they were built with sort of this set of assumptions in mind. And the set of assumptions in mind was that, if you have, the four-walled physical place you can drive to, and you have this, point of demarcation, or like where your network becomes their network, everything that comes over your firewall or the drawbridge, so to speak, you're inspecting it, you're protecting it, you're looking at every single packet, and it's all to make one guarantee, that everything outside is bad and everything inside is good. It's 100% of traffic on this side is trusted. And in this new world, right, there's a different expectation. Now, when we talk about logical infrastructure like you get on public cloud, you have to kind of assume that there's either a low or sort of zero trust environment that you're going to have to cope with. And the reason for that is because when we have environments that get created, well, like it used to be in the old world, if you wanted a server put on the other side of your firewall, you'd have to call up your network operations team. You would have to ask them to physically move the cable around the other side of the firewall, and they would just say no, right? Hang up the phone. That'd be the end of the conversation. Whereas if you tell Amazon, give me a public IP address, Amazon will say, coming right up. And so we have to make these assumptions that there's going to be things that are going to be exposed that we don't necessarily want to be exposed. There's also the challenge that, a misconfiguration can lead to catastrophic problems. Take, for example, what happened with Capital One several months ago. They had a misconfigured web application filter that was able to be leveraged to then expose S3 credentials. So even though an S3 bucket they set to private had credentials exposed, all of a sudden that S3 bucket became public in a very real way, right? Data was able to be exfilled from it. So because of this new logical perimeter, we have to assume that data could be exposed, and the assumption changes. The assumption changes from, it's not 100%. It's got to be something different. Maybe it's 85%. If you're a pessimist, maybe it's 50%. If you're an optimist, maybe it's 99.9%. Whatever it is, not 100%. And as soon as it's not 100%, the model changes to this. And the assumption is now your attacker is on network. So I want to spend a couple of minutes, in just a few minutes, talking through kind of, how HashiCorp thinks about that problem. I think sort of going forward, we have this, the last kind of transformation that I think most organizations struggle with. Now, if I were sort of stack rank in terms of an executive, what they care about, well, most executives care about people, process, tools in that order. And so, HashiCorp is a tools company, like that's kind of what we're known for. But I think most importantly, we're really, there to help drive process change. And the process change looks like this. Most of our customers, they're moving from, ITIL v3, and ITIL v3 is not inherently bad. Please don't take it personally. I'm calling ITIL v3 out here, but it's the way that we've always done things. And because of the way it's structured, it can be challenging to scale with ITIL v3. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, what customers are trying to get to is, some customers call it DevOps. Say some other customers call it, CI/CD. I think any way you kind of slice and dice it, it turns out to be API-driven self-service. And I think that self-service part of it is really one of the key factors there. People want more autonomy. They want to move faster. They want developers to, own more of the stack. API driven because we want to have the largest integration surface. So if we have an API that we're able to expose, we're able to, interface with the most amount of things. It's really self-service that drives like that time to value. So let's talk about, what that time to value is, what that shift is from ITIL v3 to, DevOps, what that looks like, and how HashiCorp sort of fits in there. Okay, so I think for, being empathetic to the people consuming infrastructure, that's primarily developers. So if you're a developer, what you're being told is that if you want to provision your application, you're going to have to go through, what is effectively multiple silos of just technology, right? So the first silo is usually compute. The second is, call it, firewall. The third is load balancers. Super simple model. And so how we interface with these different teams in the ITIL model is we have a, ticket. So you need a compute resource. You want a VM on VMware? Great. File a ticket. We'll get back to you in about 2 weeks. That's typical time. Then the next hop, you file another ticket with your firewall team. Hey, I need these ports opened up. I have this IP. They'll say, absolutely, we'll get right back to you in about 3 months. That's about 12 weeks for most companies I talk to. And then the last hop is really around, filing another ticket for, an update to your F5 configuration. That's great. We'll have that done in about 8 weeks. And so this sort of what the developer cares about is, was their app successfully deployed? Now in this time, right, if you 12 plus 8 plus 2, it's 22 weeks in this super simplified model. Now for some customers, they might, improve the time to value for compute, right? So instead of 2 weeks, it's like, let's say 5 minutes. But again, looking at it from sort of end to end, this means that it's 20 weeks and 5 minutes. So we haven't really gained that much time. It's just that we've implemented efficiency in one single silo. You really have to think about the multiple silos coming together. Now, for some of our customers, one being a very large telco in the Northwest that I'm certain that you've heard of, they have, roughly 72 of these steps, and it takes them about 10 and a half months to provision infrastructure. And nobody sort of wakes up in the morning saying like, hey, I want to build a 72-step process that takes almost a year. Like no rational person, unless like, they really hated their teams that they were supporting, no rational person would ever design something like that. But that's how we ended up, because that was just how we built things within that old model. Was you have a technology team, they're in charge of a resource, and you interface with them via ticket queue. Now, how our customers perceive solving this challenge is, instead of thinking about, this kind of workflow being ticket driven, instead, most customers want to create, sort of this, they want to put automation in place to streamline that workflow. And so if we're thinking about it in terms of a provisioning service, instead of having, you file a ticket, as a developer, you should be able to file an API request. And the provisioning service is the thing that reaches out to these different things. And so as a workflow, like you're able to provide what we call an infrastructure as code document. It defines what you want to create, and the provisioning service is the one that reconciles. What did you request? I'm going to reach out to that service that you need. I'm going to create your thing, and then maybe I'll structure the order in which things get created. And so the output is your app, but instead of taking 22 weeks, you're able to get done in 5 minutes. And I think there's, some fundamental changes of, how developers are going to go to market. For some, infrastructure as code is going to be the way forward. And they're going to be able to write infrastructure as code that makes sense. For others, they're going to want to leverage what we would refer to as modules. They're basically like reusable building blocks of code. So maybe your developers want to interface, using like a standard Java module, right? Or maybe it's like a standard .NET module or C#. And the goal here is like just to, give some simple inputs. Here's my jar file, here's my region, here's how many instances I need. And then I have an output that just says, here's the DNS name for the load balancer. And that's it. That's how developers would normally consume infrastructure. We also have the ability that if developers didn't want to write infrastructure as code, what they could do is they could interface with something like a ServiceNow. And that's effectively, just the catalog they go to, and ServiceNow is the thing making the API request. So this is, the way that we try and think about how would we, create an environment where, developers feel comfortable making requests and that you're getting this, you're maximizing time to value. I think that's really what people care about. Whether it's a pull request versus a ticket, no one really cares that much. It's really about, what is that outcome? So let's talk through the different areas that HashiCorp solves, because we're not all things to all people. I think there's roughly, depending on who you ask, there's somewhere between 4 or 6 or 7 products that we ship. So let's kind of talk about what our stack looks like. I'm going to move this over a little bit. So at each layer, we try and be empathetic to, the different people that we have to solve for. Right? It's kind of at the bottom layer. Let's say you're an IT ops person, and you're primarily responsible for provisioning, that provisioning service we talked about. And the next layer up is security. And security is really, designed for a security person, as part of a security team, but also for IT ops, because IT ops frequently has to get in the middle of, how do credentials get created, how do certificates get created, that's also an IT ops problem. So the next layer up is how do we connect these applications? That's usually a network team. But with microservices environments, we frequently see this also being an IT ops problem. And for the runtime, this is meant really for developers. But in the end, I think everything comes down to an IT ops problem. That's the way it is. I think there's another kind of technology that it's not an individual technology that we ship. I think having this approach of, hey, that's great, I can create an API request, and that gets my provisioning done. That's cool. However, the downside of that is if you're producing that with no guardrails, you're gonna have a bad time. So as a good example, we have a very large insurance company that we support in Canada. They happen to be the world's largest Azure customer that I know of. Their spend went from roughly, let's call it 700,000 per month to 7 million per month, for the sake that they started offering this, full access to Azure Resource Manager. Every developer can provision anything they needed at any given time, and they saw their bills absolutely skyrocket. And so the point here is the things you have to really think about are not necessarily just technology. It's also around policy. Because you can't just give people self-service access without guardrails. And the people that this normally speaks to are usually two, right? There's a global risk and compliance group in most of our enterprise customers, and there's a finance group. Now, the finance group specifically is the one that, they're going to hold purse strings. They're going to make sure that you're meeting budget target. And so the different types of policies that we support we try and solve for both. Right? If you think about a global risk and compliance person, they want to make sure that certain resources get provisioned within certain availability zones or certain regions to meet data privacy concerns. Likewise, for finance, they want to make sure that if they give you a budget, that you're going to meet it. And so those are two different types of policies that we can think about, for example. So when I said that we have 4 or 7 or 4 or 6 or 7 technologies, kind of step through what those are. At the bottom layer, we have, as you'd expect, Terraform. So it's the provisioning technology everybody knows and loves. What I think makes Terraform so compelling for many of our enterprise customers is that when you look at kind of this process model, the thing you really need is you need a lot of these, what we call providers. And the reason for that is because if you want to, create this sort of process model that sits in the middle of everything you're doing, it needs to interface with every single thing that you could possibly have. And so Terraform has roughly, 700 or so of these providers. It looks like Zoo. I probably said 700. And the goal here is just to, any type of infrastructure that you could possibly have that has an API, we can interface with it. That way you maintain this process model consistency, and you're able to apply policies to all sorts of different technologies in the data center. The next layer up is Vault, and a new technology that we call Boundary. So most customers, if you're sort of picking and choosing like where to get started with HashiCorp, it's either Terraform or Vault. It's going to be one of those two. And the reason is pretty simple. They solve, some pretty clearly defined problems in terms of creating provisioning and automation around provisioning, as well as how do you create a central plane for secrets management. I think if I had to pick the number one use case for Vault, we can talk about it a little bit more, but really it kind of starts there. It starts with secrets management. Where it's expanded to is why we created Boundary. We created Boundary as a privileged access management tool. People were asking for that kind of capability within Vault. They want to give access to their infrastructure via, dynamic credentials. And Vault has a certain part to play in creating those credentials, dynamically, but also it's not going to manage the external connections for you. It's not going to, Vault is not going to replace a VPN anytime soon, whereas Boundary theoretically could replace a VPN for you by giving it an external interface and giving it, something that every time somebody tries to access internal infrastructure, it's going to go through that one place, that can be clearly audited and secured. I think the next layer up is really around Console for connectivity. Console is surprisingly one of our oldest products. I say surprisingly because most people, get started with Console in terms of service discovery. So if you have services that come up, they're able to register to Console. Console is basically a big phone book. They register to Console, and they're able to discover each other via a DNS name. So an app one sitting on whatever IP can register. App two can register with its IP, and they can find each other via a very clean DNS name, app1.servers.console. But Console is really, not just one product. It's really two products. It's really Console and Console Connect. And the reason why is because, Console Connect was really sort of born out of this need that when applications are connecting to each other, they can't just use the DNS name. They want to make sure that security is applied, that mutual TLS is in place, and that there's policy in place to guarantee that can app one talk to app two in a microservices environment where firewalls are just impractical to put in place. And so Connect is really around providing those interfaces. It's what we call service mesh. I think most people are familiar with service mesh from other community projects. That's how we express it. I think the last layer up is most people would know us for Nomad, which is our scale out runtime. It was modeled after Google's Borg, similar to Kubernetes. That's probably nobody's surprised that, when it comes to scale out workloads, Google did a great job defining what that looks like. Nomad is how we expressed our solution to that problem. Customers who use it successfully are, for example, like Roblox or Pandora. I think those are really, at least like I have a 10-year-old at home, so she's kind of addicted to Roblox right now. But, as far as like how that gets run, Nomad is all like, basically it's Windows workloads with Nomad that run in the background to achieve like, basically thousands of nodes of scale. I think the last technology here, and the reason I said 4 or 6 or 7 is because Sentinel is this tool right here, our policy tool, but it's embedded within all the different technologies. So for the ones that most people know, it's Vault, Terraform, Console, and Nomad. The newer ones are really around Waypoint and Boundary. Waypoint is, if you think about it as a tool like, like Cloud Foundry is a tool. It's good to express things in analogies. As sort of a developer experience, the goal of Cloud Foundry was to really present an interface so that developers could simply define the shape of their application, point it at a source code repository, and tell the platform, go make that happen for me. And so Waypoint's really around, how do we express that, instead of having this developer interface being infrastructure as code or a catalog, now all of a sudden the developer interface looks more like, build, release, and deploy. Right. So the idea here is like as a developer, you're not really thinking about the platform. You're not creating let's say like VPC definitions with networks, with NAT gateways. Like they don't have to think about those problems. They think about it in terms of I have a deployment target, right? And actually reverse that. It should be build, deploy, release. My mistake, but it's close enough. I think for the purposes of our discussion, for here we have developers. They really care about. I need to create an artifact, build it. I need to push it somewhere, and then I need to create this release around it, such that if I have version 1, 2, 3, 10, that I'm able to stagger users over it. And so this is really the problem that Waypoint solves. It gives developers a more natural interface. You define their deployment target, whether that's Kubernetes, a virtual machine, Nomad, or a serverless platform like Lambda or Google Cloud Run. You define their target, and they have a very consistent workflow around the different technologies. I think if there's anything you take away from this discussion, it's really around having workflows over technologies. That's one of the ethos of HashiCorp. That's why when we talk about this provisioning service here, that's a workflow. Submitting an API request is a workflow for interfacing those different things that gets rid of your ticket queues, and that's how you automate things. So we're very concerned about what does workflow look like. I think I've only got maybe 3 or 4 minutes left, if I'm correct here. So let's talk about that security story that most of our public sector customers are really kind of struggling with right now, as far as look at like the breach from SolarWinds. I think zero trust is a new issue where now all of a sudden it may have been zero trust has been something people have been talking about for literally decades. Now it's kind of at the forefront of discussion. Okay, so I think for most customers, just another simple model. I think the old rule is all models are wrong. Some models are useful. This is a great example of that. It's not perfect. This is your private data center. It's a four-walled place. You might zone the networks internally using different VLANs. It's super common. You might have your app tier sit on one. You may have your database sit on another. That would be no surprise. And so here's our gateway. And this is where we put, our firewalls, application filters, called SIM. And it makes that one guarantee I talked about, which is everything outside is bad, and everything inside is good. That's it. So 100% of traffic is trusted. That's the model. Now, most customers we talk to, they're looking to integrate their clouds with different technologies. That could be call it SD-WAN, Express, Direct Connect, Express Route, VPN. You're using it. I've heard of it. There's a ton of different approaches to this, and it all results kind of in the same thing. You have a very relatively flat network, and you have applications on AWS, and it looks like it's part of your corporate network. Now, I think, as I mentioned before, the model with AWS is if, like in the previous world, in the physically defined world, it was a lot harder to get things on a public network without going through a NetOps team. In the AWS world, you give it a public IP address, and congratulations, you're on the public internet. So even here, if you have resources like S3, even if it's set to private, if somebody gets those credentials through a misconfigured WAF, all of a sudden that S3 bucket turns very public. And so I think the problem here is inherently we need to secure this environment because it's porous. We need to assume our attacker is on network. So here's the different ways that HashiCorp thinks about security, and part of that zero trust story. So every customer, goes kind of through this motion. They want to look at like when they provision applications, they use a VCS, and usually like the app server writes out to logs. So the first place your attacker is going to go is your VCS. And so the goal with why customers start with HashiCorp Vault is, well, if you're storing credentials and source code, you're obviously at risk. Using a tool like Vault allows you to store those credentials in Vault. And if you're authorized, well, your app gets them back and it's ready to make its connection to the database. Now, if you're not authorized, it just drops an audit drops a log to audit, and that's it. at least you can tell what's going on in the infrastructure. Now, the second place where attackers are going to go are logging infrastructure. And that's why for most customers, they start off with secrets management. What I described was static credentials. Where most customers want to get to is dynamic credentials, where if you have credentials that have been like just dumped into Splunk by Tomcat, for example, like Tomcat will just barf out its config every time it starts, and it'll do everything possible to like sort of yield its configuration. In that case, you want to make sure that whatever's in your logging infrastructure is old info. You want to create that moving target. How Vault does that is when the request is made, Vault then goes in and dynamically creates that credential for you, and then it returns that. And that has a lease. I think that's one. How other customers have sort of started with Vault is inherently kind of an identity broker. So if you look at the way it's structured, Vault has kind of this model where similar to Terraform, it has different what we call plugins. Terraform calls them providers. So on one side you have different plugins like say like LDAP, Kerberos, Active Directory, so on and so forth. On the other side, you may have like AWS IAM, GCP IAM, and so on. And so, this kind of ends with databases. And so, like with, most users, they have an Active Directory credential. They're logging in. They authorize with Vault using that. And if you have policy, it'll give you a database credential. That's all it's doing is a translation between those two. That's it. And so what Vault allows customers to do is instead of deploying Active Directory everywhere, because you're really losing kind of the richness of the platform security, it allows you to leverage, AWS IAM in a way that gets translated into other providers. Let's say like a GCP IAM or an Azure Active Directory or an Active Directory credential. It can do the translation for you as you need them. I think I talked about privileged access management. I can't really talk about it too much today because I think realistically it's, kind of a tool that it's probably going to be at least another 6 months or a year before you start seeing it commercially. But again, like privileged access management is an area where, thinking about that identity brokering, you should be able to use a tool like Okta, for example, and get a credential like SSH, right? So Vault is the thing doing the brokering for you. The tool that is publicly facing is called Boundary. Okay, so the last two, and then I'm going to hand the mic over as far as our security story goes. You think about data security in two ways. You think about data at rest and data in transit. Now, for data at rest, most companies have been told by their GRC, you need to implement AES 256. And your developers are probably like, okay, that's great. Like, how do I do that? Your GRC will say, we have no idea. Go figure it out. And so what they'll do is they go to Stack Overflow, they copy in like Java and AES 256 in their first result, which is definitely not what you want. And that's how security gets implemented. How other customers sort of do security is they rely on things like transparent disk encrypt. Transparent disk encrypt, yeah, sure, it'll encrypt transparently. It also decrypt transparently. And so if your attacker is on network, it's going to go and select star from customer. And all of a sudden, all your data has been exfilled. Transparent disk encrypt, what it really protects you from is, someone kicking down the door to your data center, finding the disk, finding the server that they know has all your data, pulling the drives out, memorizing the order, reassembling them externally into an identical server, and that way they can replay your data config. In the last 35 years, this only happened once, and it was an inside job. So as far as like a realistic threat model on the public clouds, transparent disk encrypt is sort of a checkbox. Azure, Amazon, they have literally millions of disk drives in your data center. It's like laughable. They can't even tell you where it is. So as far as your reliance on security, transparent disk encrypt is really more like a checkbox, especially in public cloud. Where we think most customers are going to lean to is encryption as a service, where they know that they need to provide services that allow data to be encrypted and decrypted that goes into databases. That way, if that data is exfilled, like for example, a database or unstructured data like PDF blobs that contain like applications, for example, if those are encrypted, they have to be decrypted online on network using Vault. So if they're off network without Vault, it'll take them probably a few thousand years to decrypt them. But for some customers, encryption as a service does not exactly meet their criteria because it takes data and it basically creates this amorphous blob of text, and it doesn't necessarily fit schema. So we implemented a thing called tokenization. It meets the NIST SS1 criteria, and what that does is it takes a known piece of data, 6, 7, 8, 9, like a social security number, and it sort of refactors it to something that looks like a social security number, but it's anonymized. So it creates some privacy around data. So yes, you can still tell it's a social. It conforms to your data schema, but now it's quote unquote encrypted. And the last area that we have is really around. I'll sort of finish off on that kind of concept that we need an identity for everything, not just people, but also applications. If we're going to rely on things like TLS for encryption, which is what Vault sort of helps customers implement, we need to get really good at PKI. And for most customers, it's just something that they do. Like for most customers, you generate a cert once every 10 years. I think the joke is, most customers generate certs that last longer than the average employee tenure. The reason for that is like nobody wants to be here when that blows up. Simply put, that's all it is. So PKI, our theory is if you're only doing it once every 10 years, you're just not going to be that good at it. And so PKI should be one of those things where you're generating it, however often you think that you need, whether it's like once a week, once a day, once a month. It should be something that's regular practice and it's automated. And so this is the basis for where we believe identity needs to go. That goes for both applications, that's for users. They all get generated essentially a certificate that's verifiable for them. So that's the basis for how HashiCorp thinks about security, and also a big part of our vision. So I guess I'll turn it over to Joyce. Thank you, Joyce, for hanging in there. I think for now I'll stop sharing.
Real quick, Brent, we have a few questions. I think what we'll do is we'll save them. They're on the chat. Why don't you take a look at them, and then we can save them for after Joyce is done. And then I know we're gonna have some time, so that would be great if we could just answer them verbally for folks, or you can answer them in the chat either way.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
And with that, we want to do another welcome to Joyce joining us today. She's in the city of LA with the city of LA ITA. She's executive officer and a deputy CIO. So Joyce, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share a very short slide deck, and I'm also going to turn my screen off because I don't like watching myself either. Let's see. Oops. Maybe it's not going to let me do this. Let's see. I have to apologize because I am not a Zoom person. I am, there it is. I am a Google Meets person because the city is a Google shop. So starting over at the top, this is not going to be a technical presentation from me. I thank HashiCorp for taking care of that for us. This is really a management perspective of why the city and ITA decided to go with HashiCorp and Terraform. So our challenge has been, and COVID has helped push us into that. We are a shop that is trying to modernize, like a lot of government shops. The recession of 2008 hit us really, really hard, and we've been digging ourselves out ever since the recession ended. We were actually in a really good spot, and then COVID hit. And the nice flowing river that we were on to modernization turned into a tidal wave. And so we've had to do a lot of changes and make a lot of moves very quickly. So The title of this is Making Oxymoron a Truth, Lean and Agile Government, which is not usually phrases that you hear in the same sentence. So Los Angeles is really a megacity. We are the second largest city in the nation. We have over 250,000 businesses, and that was a count that was done a few years ago, so it's probably a lot higher now. And we are broad. We go, of course, television, movies. Hollywood is considered Los Angeles. We are a great tech area. Video games and aerospace is all Los Angeles as well. We also are a fashion center. I don't know if anybody would have realized that, but we are. And of course, transportation, because we span a huge amount of geographic area. Our GNP rivals a lot of many countries. And because of our wonderful climate, we draw over 50 million tourists a year to visit our city. Pre-COVID, of course, and we're hoping again post-COVID. We are also the creative capital of the world. We have almost 1,000 museums and art galleries in the greater Los Angeles area. I bumped that up because, again, the 841 number was done a few years ago. We do span 469 square miles. We are larger than a lot of countries in Europe. At our last census, we were over 4 million people, and so the census that was just done hasn't been released yet. So we anticipate that that number is going to go up considerably. We have over 140 countries represented in our city, with over 224 languages to connect with, and also 224 languages that at some point in our process of working with the public, we are expected to be able to speak the language of the public that is working with us. We are also a multi-tiered dragon when it comes to our bosses. We have an elected mayor and 15 elected council districts, an elected controller, and an elected city attorney, all of whom we have to address as boss. So how do you support a megacity? Today's day, we have to do it with cloud. We don't have a choice. Our data center, if we could build it to support the needs of the city, would never be big enough. We do have a data center on-prem, and on-prem compute power was our previous mode of operation. But honestly, we can't keep up with it, and we can't afford it. I was actually pleased to hear the timeline for provisioning that was spoken earlier, because I thought we were bad. I was actually going to tell you, you have to add about 8 to 12 months to any one of those when we're talking about provisioning the way we used to do it, because the procurement process with government is really bad and very time consuming and very hard. And when our city attorney, our city administrative office, who is our bean counter, our accountant, would come to us with budgets every year. Every 5 to 7 years, we would end up telling them, well, we need $250,000 because we have to buy a new VM setup, maybe even more. It was really hard for them to budget that. About 2 or 3 years ago, as we were making our way into the cloud, and it was a more constant spend for them to budget off of, their response to us is, I don't ever want to buy you another server again, so just go to the cloud. Unfortunately, we can't go completely in the cloud because there are workloads that our public safety, for example, really want us to have on-prem. So our police, our fire that do EMS services really want a lot of that on-prem. So we are a hybrid shop. But the cloud has enabled us to be on our toes instead of on our heels. When we need to do something and we need to stand up an application or bring in a platform very quickly, we are able to do that much more fast, much more quickly, much more securely, and with the greater flexibility to be able to meet the demands of 43 different departments in the city. So our key to automation is to go from infrastructure, from ClickOps to infrastructure as code. We are adopting the Henry Ford or the Toyota efficiency model. And that's why Terraform was very important to us. It allowed us to create the templates in a small, medium, large, extra large kind of t-shirt model for the different environments and platforms that we work with. So we have that set up for our Drupal web CMS. We have that set up for our Java and our JavaScript implementations. We have it set up for our data, Oracle and databases setup. It allows our sysads to codify the various steps and process, which creates consistency and better security all around. One thing that was released, so I can say it, we did have a security breach. It was a small one about 2 years ago. And it was done, honestly, by a department that in the city, and we didn't even know that they were out there doing this. But they had created a cloud operation, and they had created a backdoor with another NIC card, and we didn't know it. And they didn't know it. They forgot about it. And we had a breach with somebody coming in on that. Using Terraform and these templates, that's a hole we've closed up. So we're anticipating that this is going to help our security efforts a lot. It also allows our folks to get out of the grunt work of having to do the tedious work that it takes to provision. And it allows them to do the work that only they can do, the things that they have to think about and really make decisions on, research and evaluate. It leads to fewer errors and more reliable workflows. And it's more efficient because as a city, we are all faced with something pretty similar that a lot of you are probably faced with, and that's a silver tsunami. So we've got a lot of people walking out the door. And because COVID and how that's affected our economy, we have not been able to hire. So we have to be able to do the workload that is increasing with a smaller number of staff. So we have to think of the benefits. Validating, matching, focusing, and flexibility and the innovation. That's what this allows us to do. We validate our work. We're able to match what's being done end to end. We're able to focus on the things that we need to focus on. We're able to be flexible and fast. And that allows us the time to innovate. And that's my presentation.
Well, thanks. That was fantastic. It's, he gave us some things to think about. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how fast do we run? Where should we start? How do we go from a cloud? How do we get to a cloud model? And you hit the nail on the head. A lot of people don't think about it from a hybrid standpoint. It really is hard to just do a hard cut to the cloud. There's going to be things that have to live on-prem as you migrate more to the cloud. So we're seeing that with even our biggest customers around the globe, that there's still operations in a hybrid cloud. And one of the questions that came up was about multi-cloud. So let's open up the floor for questions. And thanks again, Joyce, for covering that with us. So Brent, do you want to address any of the questions that were asked in the chat, or do you just want to open the floor, or what's your preference?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would give everyone a minute to sort of formulate their thoughts. Some of the, one of the comments that was made was about SolarWinds. I think, SolarWinds was not only, it's complicated to think about from a vendor perspective because you have to think about how you build and deliver your software. For most end customers, we're thinking about endpoint security. And endpoint security used to be, how do you secure people's laptops and the data that goes on them? I think new endpoint security is how do you secure all the API endpoints that we have internally and all the services we have internally. So the SolarWinds breach kind of notoriously attacked all these sorts of Active Directory installations that, it got very quickly interwound in. So I think for us, we're aggressively pursuing a a security audit with all the different SaaS vendors. I think any modern software company has multiple SaaS vendors they rely upon. And, our chief security officer, he is all over solving that problem. It's not really, I would say, like we actively conduct security audits on our own source code. We have a security team that does pen testing. But also now it's about like applying that same sort of rigor to our vendors. So I think that's one. I think the other one is about how do you secure endpoints internally? I think for us, we, of course, like most customers, should be using TLS for all traffic. I think the assumption is that, good or bad, most customers have sort of moved on to, cutting credentials and a security certificate for, encrypted traffic for all of their services or most of their services, but not everyone and not in every case. Right. So we want to get that to as close to 100% coverage as we can. I think our approach, I mentioned Console Connect earlier, applying that sort of rigor where you're, using firewalls to create those secure endpoints, that's going to be really problematic for microservices environments. If you've adopted things like Kubernetes, Nomad, it's just impossible to sort of between the different hosts apply, firewalls. You just can't do it. Can't maintain it all. So that's really the goal of Console Connect, is securing those endpoints to sort of live across those different platforms as well.
Can I make one comment, please, about what you just said?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
You could use something like ISTO to control that internal network for yourself to ensure that your microservices are only talking to the necessary endpoints internally for itself for internal communication on your service mesh. That is one point. Then you use Envoy to then control the ingress and egress points of view going in and out of your Kubernetes. With that being said, this is going back to what I said in a comment, that you have to look at the 4 C's of way the Kubernetes group think about security internally for any cloud provider, that these types of rigors should be put in place and using in concert with the idea of vault and key cloak to allow it to then be controlled in a very dynamic way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely correct. I mean that, so code security is one thing. We have customers investing very heavily in like code scanning tools. Can they guarantee that apps, when they get deployed, there's a certain level of security rigor involved, as well as like, using tools like Black Duck to sort of audit the open source libraries they're using as well. So that's fair. Tools like Istio, that's a direct competitor to Console Connect. We use Envoy as well as a proxy. It's pretty industry standard at this point. To sort of guarantee those secure communications. I agree that there's a level of depth that you're going to have to apply, where I think, Kubernetes is so container centric that I understand how they see the world. Not every customer is going to see the world through the lens of a container. They're going to see the world through the lens of what are their API endpoints and what are those applications, regardless of the underlying technology primitive, whether it's a VM or a container. So that's where I have like I understand their perspective and I agree with it for their platform. It's just like not a holistic strategy. Not every enterprise. I mean, I talk to the biggest enterprises we could possibly talk to. Exactly 0 of them have adopted containers for all of their infrastructure. Right. So I think it's going to be a slow motion there.
I agree with it that there is no all, but you have to then design for security first with these points of view. And if your cloud provider gives you these controls outside of Kubernetes for its own solutions, you should embrace these things, audit these things, and also see how much drift you have within your own security model to have most minimalistic authorization to any access of any type of object within your cloud.
Yeah, you're going to hear no argument for me about that. I think that's a prudent strategy. I think for sure, like tools like PAM were heinously expensive. It was all about that. It was, I think for most people creating infrastructure, they're trying to get people away from logging in directly to infrastructure to, as you talk about minimal access. Do you even need access to infrastructure? I think for teams that absolutely need it, you have to have, some sort of like PAM tool in place. Otherwise, it's just, people run amok and they're making all sorts of changes and who knows what's happening on each machine.
A question for Joyce. Joyce, what would you say to other either cities or counties or even states, state departments trying to get to a more hybrid model, but having to explain to maybe more of the bean counters, as you mentioned, having to explain what the difference is to the traditional spend that they've been providing you? How do you educate and get their buy-in? I think you're muted, but I feel like you're saying good stuff.
As far as what the city administrative officer told us, it was really, and he was very blunt about it. It was a accounting ease for him. Cloud gave him the ability to budget for us, basically. He understands that we've got departments that are very powerful in the city, police, fire. They always have a huge draw, babies will die kind of thing. And so when they say that they really just don't trust cloud yet, they have to stay on-prem, that we really have to honor that as an IT shop. So all he's really asking is that our footprint on-prem is kept to the bare minimum of what we really have to do. We are a multi-vendor cloud environment, though. We use Amazon, Azure, and Google.
Nice.
We're a Google shop for office products and things like that, but we are using GCP. We're going to be using it for our data analysis, data science projects, and probably some other things too, but that's our first focus. We were just able to bring that contract in. Amazon, of course, has always been a leader. Azure, we have a smaller footprint on, but we do have some departments that are very Microsoft Pro. So that's out there. From a business standpoint, the other reason we've got multi-platforms, multi-vendor platforms out there is because even though government tends to do contracts with people, and they tend to kind of silo that and go solo with one vendor, we found that long-term has been a problem for us. So we have usually at least 2, if not 3, vendor options in any kind of environment. So our CRM, we have 3 different right now platforms that we use in our department, and for behalf of other people in the city, we have the 3 cloud vendors, because it also fosters a continued kind of competition. So we get the best of everybody on an ongoing basis. So that's just a business decision that we've made.
Yeah, I asked the question to you because sometimes people can look at cloud or multi-cloud as a shiny, it's a necessary, right? But they may think of it as, hey, look, this is a shiny object. You want to put more money into this because this is where the future is. And some people are worried about runaway cost, right? How do you contain that? And I think you just articulated that, because what Brent mentioned in the first part of the presentation was, you want to provision to the cloud? Sure, they can provision. They can spin something up for you immediately, right? But guess what? You're on the hook to pay for it. So
Right.
how do you control that, right?
That's actually a very interesting point, that conversation about the company that used ServiceNow, because we're a ServiceNow shop too. We had considered doing that, having developers make a request to ServiceNow and just having it go through and do the provisioning for us using Terraform, and APIs. But we started thinking, because we're always very tight on money. Okay, so how do we do the approval process? How do we decrement that from a budget, quote unquote? And so it was very difficult, as is when we went into cloud, and it was so much easier for our DBAs to get a test environment. We started seeing all these environments out there. So my guys are probably tired of hearing it, but the first conversation that we have in our meetings is, okay, so are you cleaning up the environments? That developer or that database administrator has 5 environments that they're using right now, really? So you have to really keep on top of that, because you are paying for this. I think when we were all on-prem, there was it was easier to disassociate cost. And so you can't do that with cloud.
Thank you. Anyone else want to ask, be brave and ask a question to either of the presenters?
I think there was one question in the chat. Maybe I'd probably be better positioned to answer it. It's how does Waypoint fit into the architecture? I think Waypoint is a service that we just announced what we call HashiCorp Cloud Platform Vault, and that's a service that HashiCorp hosts. It is the intent that we have that on a roadmap to sort of offer this central service that you could go to, that you could host. It's the various HashiCorp software. Waypoint being one of those is our eventual target. So Waypoint is a service you would have to host somewhere where your developers would interface directly with it to say, Waypoint, sort of Waypoint build, deploy, and release. And they would use those commands, or they could use Waypoint up, sort of like Vagrant. And I think the idea there is that, for Waypoint, it gives a really, instead of giving it an infrastructure as code abstraction where they have to code infrastructure, instead they're using a command line utility that interfaces, between their code repository and allows them an experience very similar to like an OpenShift or a Cloud Foundry, where they can just say like Waypoint build, it will build it, according to like a CI host. It will take the artifact and then you say Waypoint deploy, and it will deploy it, and then you create a release around it, around like what version is out there. So the architecture is pretty simple. It's that you have a service that runs somewhere. Most customers are going to opt to run it, probably on a public cloud provider. That's where most are going to deploy to kind of in the future, but it can run anywhere realistically. And I think the second point is, what does it plug into? Like, what does it deploy to? You need something. Now, for most customers I talk to, they're looking at, they deploy traditional VMs. That's how we've always done things, at least for the last like 15 or 20 years. Sort of going forward, now we have to support this plethora of new platforms, right? So part of it is, serverless, like Lambda, for example, or Google Cloud Run. So I think if you're going to use serverless now and you want automation, most customers use Terraform. That's, in our view, that's not the right abstraction for it. Like, you want something that's more centered around like, what's the developer workflow, not forcing the developer to learn all kind of the, how do the abstractions fit together. That can be more challenging, less challenging if you use modules, right, or a catalog, but still, if you're asking them to write infrastructure as code, it can be difficult. And I think the point here is like, you define their deployment target for them. What is that integration? Is it a Kubernetes cluster? Is it a Nomad cluster? Is it, provider Kubernetes? Is it on-prem Kubernetes? Like, we don't really care. It doesn't really matter to us. The goal here is to provide that workflow that's more target agnostic. And then you can just tell it like, here's the platform, here's what my app looks like, here's the source code, just go make it happen.
Hey, Joyce, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, the question for you, I asked people, it's kind of a zinger. So if you want to defer, that's fine. But no, I'm just kidding. So there's we all talk about DevSecOps, right? People talk about that, or DevOps. I guess the premise is the workflow, as Brent was talking about, right? How do these different groups work together, right? The development folks, the operations folks, the security folks. Any comments from you on that, or how it works for you in the city there, or things that lessons learned that you want to share? Or
so the city is going through a modernization, and so is our department, honestly. We just moved our mainframe off to the state, so we just got rid of our mainframe. We still have a small workload up on the state, though, so I can't say we're out of that altogether. Our developers, our sysadmins, they were very traditional, probably up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, extremely traditional. There were a lot of heated conversations about what a systems, well, we call them systems programmers, but they're sysadmins, what they do and what they don't do. They don't code. So having to bring them around to the idea that infrastructure is code now. I know you love your server and you go down and hug it every morning, but that's not going to happen anymore. So trying to give them the opportunity to make that switch, to feel comfortable making that switch. This may be a very PR kind of thing to say, but the silver tsunami in a lot of ways for government was a blessing in disguise. There were a lot of people that are retiring, and that's good because they were able to work their careers to what they knew, what they were comfortable with, and retire on their own terms. We're bringing in a new wave of people, the next generation, and they are all folks that are embracing this. They're excited, and they're even more excited about being able to come in and sort of be the hero and save government and make us better. This new wave, this new generation, I can say this because I'm old, they're really coming in with the Peace Corps mentality, where they want government to do good for people and to serve people. And if they can do that with their IT skills, they're very happy to do that. So, you know, it's sort of a alignment of the stars, I think, in a lot of ways. And so we're finding more and more as we go through this, we're not having that kind of huge, horrible discussions anymore. People are just saying, okay. And then we're bringing in products like Terraform, and they're saying, wow, this is actually not hard. It's not bad. So it's a good thing overall.
Oh, I love that. I never heard the silver tsunami. I didn't know what you meant at first, but then I picked up on it as you explained. But that's an interesting perspective. I didn't even think about that. You know, tools with some, you know, fresh blood or new eyes working in government and different types of passion. So that was really well said. Thank you. Anyone else? We got like 2 minutes left, 3 minutes left. Crunch time. Throw anything out that you want. I'd love someone to stump Brent.
I've learned very quickly not to goad people like that.
Someone should have given me a question to ask you that could have stumped you. Okay, well, I hope you all had a chance to shoot any questions you have out there. I don't know if we have contact information. I don't think that's how we're doing it, but again, I want to thank Joyce for joining us, and hopefully we didn't put you on the spot too much. And thanks for sharing a little bit about your journey, and thank you for your team and everything that they're doing with HashiCorp. And then Brent, I want to thank you as well for taking some time, and then everyone else for joining in. Allison, is there any way that if people have questions, they can follow up after the fact? I probably should have asked you that at the beginning.
Yeah, no, there'll be thank you note that will go out to everyone with some contact information and additional resources, so they can just reply to that if anything. Okay, don't forget to use your Uber Eats. I think it expires today. That's how those things work. This will be my first time. And I just want to say thank you. Everyone have a great day. And again, thank you. Thanks, Joyce.